I can't pronounce it. Sorry. I trained myself before, and I said, okay, I need to train myself because I can say it in French, but the intonation is different.
I know.
Les existentialistes. I can say that in French. Existentialist. Anyway, good enough. Why? Because it's French, So I put my black thing,
I should have known.
That's it. I say, why not? Why not the French thing? In this episode, we exchange for the fourth time with our favorite philosopher, Greg Sadler. Greg is a speaker, content producer, and author who makes complex philosophical topics accessible. He has produced over 1,000 videos on his YouTube channel. In this episode, we discuss about existentialism, how, contrary to what most of us think, it is an optimistic doctrine, why it is up to us to find meaning, why Greg thinks that the problem we have today is a surplus of meaning. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deafandgal.com. It would also be a massive help to us if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can do right now by simply clicking the subscribe button. Now, enjoy this episode, Finding Meaning in a Meaningless Universe.
So there's this general notion that the existentialists are, like, you were saying, Olivier, people who wear black turtlenecks and they sit around and maybe smoke cigarettes and drink coffee and talk about how meaningless life is and how but the positive side of that is we can either like despair. And I think in the popular culture, that's the way existentialists are figured. They're just these doom and gloom people, almost like, pre-goth goths, without so much of the romanticism mixed in. Like, for example, in television shows and movies in the 80s and 90s here in the States, right? The existentialist is this person who just says it's all crap and nobody believes in anything. But all the existentialist thinkers say, no, it's up to us to figure out some meaning for ourselves, to not kill ourselves, whether it be, in a dramatic way or by drinking ourselves to death or choosing some absolutely doomed thing. We have a responsibility because of this lack of absolute values or structures. So it's kind of an optimistic doctrine when you get down to,
So it's almost like it's that search for, our purpose is to find the purpose in meaninglessness.
Yeah, well, the meaninglessness provides an initial realistic starting point, you could say, from the existentialist perspective. But then it's up to us to go beyond that. And you never get to the point where you can then build an absolutely solid foundation that's going to remain for all time. But somehow you have to get to the point where that's good enough for you. So, for example, I was talking about this cat that we have here who's 17 years old and still goes up and down the stairs and plays with, little rings from soda bottles and acts kind of kitten-like. She's very affectionate with me. I'm not going to become a cat person, right? Like the proverbial cat lady, but she's an important part of my life. And if I want to take an existentialist stance, there's nothing wrong with devoting my time to making her life enjoyable, even though she can't grasp the ultimate meaninglessness of life or anything like that. Chatting about her isn't totally meaningless. It can provide, points of connection between other human beings. None of those things are totally without value. They just don't have absolute value. I mean, that you could say is where the crazy cat person shows who they are. They think that their relationship with fuzzy animals is somehow given an absolute meaning to life. I mean, the existentialists would say that we, drinking good coffee that's locally brewed, it's still a good thing, even if it rests on a foundation of ultimate meaninglessness.
So is it like you need to find like small things every time? Because like I understand the concept of the world, the cosmos, the universe as right? So does it mean so you cannot have like grand foundations? So you need to go like little?
Yeah, I think for most of us that's the case, and not to despise the little things, not to despise the conversation that we have with the person who we see each day, and we're not really friends, but we do communicate with them, and we would feel something if they're missing, and they enjoy seeing us. That's a small thing, but it's still a good. It's still something meaningful within the world. There could be some cases where we actually do get to participate in a much larger drama, but most of the time we just find ourselves in those sort of situations. Heidegger talks about this thing he calls thrownness. Sartre uses that and sort of refigures it to talk about us always being in situations. And I think that's quite right. Having my kids, as I was mentioning, going through their typical adolescent stuff, you can kind of plan for it, but nothing ever turns out remotely like what you planned for, the contingencies. And then you have to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? So my daughter, this is not recently, but a while back, she went through this terrible, first breakup with a guy who was clearly bad news. And fortunately, my wife and I were here and were able to give her some insight about that sort of thing. But that's a situation in which you have to make choices. We could have chosen to say, don't worry about it. Many fish in the sea. Let's go have ice cream, and forget about it. Or we could have said, like, you should stay with him. It's very important that you hold on to. There's like a myriad of possibilities. There's nobody to say, well, this is the one that you should have picked. And so I think that's part of what all the existentialists, whether they are theistic existentialists or atheistic existentialists, they'd all say, listen, it's up to us to figure out what we're going to do. There's no like blueprint or master plan for it.
It's basically based on the actions that you've taken, so you define yourself based on the actions, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, again, to go back to Sartre's existentialism is a humanism. He's got that nice passage where he says nobody's born a coward. People make themselves cowards by how they behave in the situations that they're thrown into, and it's ultimately up to them. So this, I mean, and it corresponds to our experience. I mean, think about the people that we've seen who were like, that person, I'd never expect a brave act out of them, and yet they do courageous things. And then we see these other people who we think are, consistently brave, and they let us down.
Just to try and capture that and sum it up to for my understanding. So it's they're coming from a place of saying, right, there's no such thing as a master plan. There's no overall big meaning.
Yeah.
And you are defined yourself, and your meaning comes from how you respond to the situations that are presented to you.
Yeah, that's part of it. And it's also how you relate to other people's doing the same thing.
Okay.
So, like Sartre, this is where he and de Beauvoir are quite different from each other in two really important ways. One is that he's very distrustful of other people's freedom. He views other people's freedom as kind of like a threat, He's got that in Being in Nothingness. He talks about like the other person coming into the field and like sucking all the meaning towards them and all that. It's always in these very antagonistic terms. And de Beauvoir says, yeah, that's often the case. You think about like the colonizer versus colonized. Okay, they're not going to see eye to eye on stuff, but it doesn't always have to be that way. But she recognizes that a lot of times it's solidarity with another person. So like what we're doing right here, right? Let's say we're all existentialists and it's all bullshit and meaningless at bottom. So why are we doing this podcast thing, right? Why are we collaborating on this thing and for I'm talking, and then you'll talk, and then Olivier will talk, and why are we creating meaning here? So I think de Beauvoir is better at explaining that sort of thing than Sartre is. And there's another thing too where they kind of differ. There's this tendency when people to become existentialists to say, okay, so I'm responsible for everything. You're responsible for everything. So if you're a jerk, you're totally responsible for that. And you don't get to make any excuses for anything whatsoever. And de Beauvoir says, well, that works for people who like grow up within a situation of freedom and have all sorts of opportunities, but maybe it doesn't work for people who are growing up in let's say, conditions that stunt their development. Not everybody has the same degree of freedom and responsibility. Later on, if they're able to grow, then they acquire it. But if you grow up in a family of people who actually believe the Earth is flat, you're not as responsible for believing the Earth is flat as the guy out on the street who just happened to watch some YouTube videos and got convinced by it.
But that's the thing as well, is how do we, because it's about choices and personal.
Yeah.
Now, so how do we extract ourselves from, the culture narrative, the education that we receive, whatever we see on TV? It's so easy to be sucked up by that.
Yeah.
And existentialist says, well, no, it's, you have to make your own choices because it's a meaningless world, something like that. So it's up to you.
Yes. So how do the existentialists deal with that problem of people who are, I suppose it's that nature nurture thing. The people who have been sort of nurtured so strongly that it's, as you said, that they believe the Earth is flat because of how they were brought up. What's the existentialist view on?
Well, that varies. I mean, like Sartre, I think he would hold them pretty much completely responsible. He'd say at bottom they've lied to themselves in some way. And de Beauvoir would say, nah, you have to grow into more and more freedom over time. And some of the other existentialists, I think, like Nietzsche, for example, he thought that a lot of Western culture in his own time, and I think he'd think the same about most of our culture at present, was all ways of being members of a herd, ways of avoiding having to take responsibility. Whereas de Beauvoir would say, well, it's tragic that some people grow up in a flat earth, household and get it constantly reinforced and can't see out of that. And we can use it as a stand-in for anything. Think about racism, for example. And the whole notion of there being like distinct races and they each have their own little, quirks and we shouldn't let them mix together. That's a whole ideology that held sway for a couple hundred years. And it's tough to get out of, It's probably tougher for somebody growing up in certain households and areas here in the United States than in others. Nietzsche would say, well, people like that, they don't really have any value of their own. They're not even poor bastards. They're almost sort of like stand-ins for people, I think. Some people say, oh, Nietzsche doesn't really mean these things that he says about degenerates and ressentiment and culture and all that. But I think he is serious about that. Gabriel Marcel, I think, would be a bit more forgiving towards people. But then again, he doesn't believe life is meaningless. He believes life is mysterious. So there is sort of a grand scheme, but we can't see it, and it takes a lot of working at it. No science or even philosophical analysis is going to bring it out to all of us. And I'd say thinkers like Rilke follow along that line as well. So there isn't like a single existentialist take on that.
You mentioned at the beginning, we have a representation of these people like wearing black, smoking cigarettes, and say, well, it's all shit, it's crap, nothing, there's no sense. But I think there's a fine line between, what you said about what they think and nihilism. I think sometimes we put existentialism and nihilism together somehow. Mm-hmm. Is it the case?
Sometimes, yeah. I think the way some people read, say, Nietzsche or Sartre in particular, they view them, or Camus, as endorsing a kind of nihilism. But I think that's That's because they don't read far enough into them. Nietzsche thought that nihilism was the great problem of his century and the century to come that we've already, sort of put a cap on. We're now in the century after that. And I think he was right about that. So Nietzsche didn't have a satisfactory answer about what we ought to do. He had some notes, you could say, some of which may be useful for us, some of which we should be like, yeah, I don't want to do that.
Just out of curiosity, what was his views or what he was saying?
Well, what's positive about Nietzsche is the notion that we need to cultivate something like our own interiority in what he calls solitude, Einsamkeit. And this is a term that Rilke uses and makes a lot out of as well. But yeah, so I mean, what else is positive? Sort of diagnosis of how many things that seem to be liberating or helping us to define who we aren't really so. They're just ways of sucking us into somebody's program and making us like everybody else. I mean, think about it in our own day, right? I mentioned consumerism. We have a consumerism of the intellectual world where people put on all sorts of, salons or things like that. And they talk about the same crap that everybody else does. And, we have all these videos out there that do kind of like a surface level analysis, but are very, very polished about, let's say, for example, about Hegel, right? Everybody picks up on Hegel's master-slave dialectic, which is just a tiny, tiny little portion of the phenomenology. And they like it because it's a sexy topic, master-slave, can tie it in with dominance and submission. And then they ignore all the other stuff that he has to say that's much more interesting. So Nietzsche would, he'd say a lot of those lures, we need to avoid them. He also thought that the state he talks about this in Zarathustra, he calls the state the new idol. And he says that there's a tendency for it to suck in the people who have more to offer and to make them part of its apparatus.
This thing very much about not giving up the sense of individuality, and it was about all those things were to lure you. They were. It was almost like a call to abdicate responsibility, and I think that what I got from Nietzsche was just his anger came from that sort of almost willingly walking into slavery and giving up that sense of identity and who you are. And that's why I got the sort of the anger that I picked up on. It's a long time since I've reread any, but it stayed with me anyway.
I think that's right. And I think he is angry. The other thing too is there's all these, especially in our day, there's all these ways in which people are being offered a certain kind of individuality that's not really individuality.
What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I mean, think about Apple's landmark advertising campaign from years and years and years ago. I remember when I first saw it, I was like, man, I don't like Apple people because of that. It was that, think differently thing. And it had like the totalitarian society. And then this girl comes in, does basically a hammer throw and just cracks the screen. And I was like, great. Now we're going to have even more of these people, carrying around, doing things with Apple, talking about what individuals they are. And, I probably went a little bit over to the other side. There's all these things that people do where they are trying to work out something that's individual. And then other people catch on to it and it becomes a fad, and then it becomes a lifestyle. And then you can by now we're really, really good. We've got a couple of decades of learning how to monetize everything. So.
It's that thing again. It's that, and this sort of comes back to the existentialist bit in terms of that meaning. It's we've got that double bind of a need for individuality, but also a need for belonging.
Yes.
So, I mean, how does that sit with the existentialist views?
Yeah, and this isn't something I think that's unique to existentialist literature. We've got all and it's not even unique to literature. You see this in film, right? You got the innovator who rises because of their talent, and they do something and people really like it. You see them at the end and they're very isolated, even though they have like millions of followers, but they have no they have no genuine, authentic relationships anymore. I mean, this goes all the way back to ancient times, right? Where people would rise through either a dynasty or establishing something new within the power structure, and now they're ruling hundreds of thousands, but they can't trust anybody. So it's not a radically new dynamic. But to swing back, I think Nietzsche really does want us to have authentic personal relationships. He recognizes that we're usually kind of a mess and we can't idealize them. He even says that when we have virtues, our virtues war against each other, sort of like jealous girlfriends who want to pull you this way and this way and this way. So we can't expect ourselves to be like totally finished. And it's okay for us to be in conflict with those who we love or feel affection towards or have good conversations with, because those can be productive as well, so long as we conduct ourselves in the right way. You might think about when if you think about what couples break up over, besides finance, sex, and children, politics nowadays is a huge one, right? And so, or we'll take a friendship, right? Let's say you and I hang out all the time, and some new wrinkle with Brexit comes in, right? Because there's always some new development, and you stake out one position, I stake out another, and now we're arguing with each other, and we're doing so using talking points coming from the parties or the media or something like that. That's very different than you and I having an authentic conversation about what we see as the common good. Now we're just sort of talking on the behalf of other people at each other.
That's we're arguing other people's positions.
Yeah. I myself, when I see things where somebody's talking about this is how underfunding this has affected me and my family, I can relate to that, and I feel that's when it's it's not just some made up thing. I feel that's much more authentic than bringing up some talking point that somebody got from, I don't know, a press release or something along those lines.
So you hear the news, we talk about climate change, we talk about human extinction like as a possibility, which is so this meaning, like today this world starts to be meaningless as well, because we have what meaning is possible today here on this planet. When you look at all this news, we talked about consumerism as well. So, and you see lots of tension in countries as well. Like all this start to be very shaky. So where's the meaning right now?
It's not that we don't have meaning. It could be that we actually have like a surplus. We have so much meaning out there that we're not sure what to do. Like the person who goes into the grocery store and experiences what we call the paradox of choice, where they see like a million different kinds of spaghetti sauce, and now they can't choose because, I might like one that has both mushrooms and black olives and red wine in it, but this one over here has some Parmesan. So we can't manage to bring together all the different meaning into one coherent picture, and so we're always in a process of selection, you could say. The existentialists themselves didn't talk about that so much, but I think when we look at some of the thinkers who came after them that we often call postmodernists or post-structuralists, they were pretty attentive to that, or the hermeneutics movement in philosophy, that the notion that we're always engaged in interpretation and that we're responsible for the interpretations that we put together, and that you and I might be able to come up with something that we share more or less, but there's still going to be divergences. Whether it's on like a family level where you're like, I really like this person. I'm like, well, he's a prick, and you're like, well, he's not a prick to me. And I'm like, well, you don't see him when he gets drunk. There's divergences in interpreting the situation. And then, well, how should we behave towards this person? Should we invite him to the party or not invite him to the party? And then it can go all the way up to like neighborhoods and study groups and consumer bases. People arguing with each other about whether this music is authentically this or that.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.